sometimes we stop our stories because something happens we didn't expect. We're surprised. So that's another cue to creativity.
Some of the most famous creative insights came about as a result of a surprise. So people have a particular perspective, but they may encounter information or other perspectives that completely change their point of view. And I think that there are many famous examples, but we can point to one in particular, which was the invention of Teflon. And so the story goes, in 1938, Roy Plunkett was a scientist with DuPont, and he was working on ways to make refrigerators more home-friendly by searching for ways to replace the current refrigerant, which was primarily made of ammonia, sulfur dioxide, and propane. After opening the container on one particular sample he'd been developing, Plunkett found his experimental gas had completely dissipated, and all that was left was a strange, slippery resin that was resistant to extreme heat and chemicals. In the 1940s, this material was actually used by the Manhattan Project that was busy developing nuclear weapons. A decade later, it found its way into the automotive industry, but it wasn't until the 1960s that Teflon would be used for its most noted application, which is nonstick cookware. Right. Sometimes we're moving forward with our existing perspectives and surprises happen, right? And then that can cue us to the possibility of creativity. And so I think, one starting point to think about is, why do surprises happen? What does it mean? I mean, it sounds like an obvious question. But if we think about it more deeply, it's not obvious why I react with surprise in a given situation.
No, absolutely. I mean, two main reasons, right? So the first reason we experience surprise is we have to remember our perspectives are limited, right? We don't think of every possibility. We can't have all knowledge brought to bear in every situation. So a perspective is a limited view on what's going on. And as soon as you have a limited view of what's going on, something may pop up that's beyond the view, right? So partly it's a matter of just ordinary thinking. The limits of our little poor brains mean that things are going to happen that are beyond what we brought into our perspective in the first place. And then the second piece is the world changes, right? So chance happens, things occur that you didn't expect, didn't predict, couldn't have known about, etc. And so those are reasons why the world doesn't fit your perspective, and that means, what's going on, right? Surprise.
And so if we live in a world that never changes, right, that never happens, right? So surprises are clearly something we have to grapple with. So why then does that surprise response prompt change? Like, what's the underlying process there?
Mostly it's a desire to understand, right? So I didn't expect that. And what does that mean? So if you're surprised, it means my perspective just failed me. Right? So surprise is another name for surprise in the academic literature, is expectation failure. Right? Your perspective led you to have an expectation.
I prefer the term surprise myself.
And that expectation failed. Surprise is much better. But I think but that gives you an indication that we have some we don't want a world where we don't know what's going on, where we can't explain what's happening, right? That's incredibly scary and anxiety provoking, right? We want to have some sense of being able to have an understanding of what's happening around us. So when we're surprised, it means, hey, you got to learn something because you didn't predict this.
Right? It's interesting that, I think, again, we see a fork in the road. You could reach for really superficial explanations to dismiss the surprise and move on, right? And not change. Or you could engage in deeper thinking, right? And I guess that would be, again, motivated by curiosity and your genuine desire to understand things.
Absolutely. Oh, the computer just does funny things, like, oh, well. Right? So you can just ignore it, right? And explain away.
Right, which would be superstitious learning, or, you just you reach for these superficial explanations that allow you to kind of preserve your sense that you know what's going on, but it doesn't really lead you to deeper thinking.
That's right. You preserve your perspective instead of changing it.
Right. So how do we avoid that and actually use surprise to our advantage? How do we use it?
Well, oddly, the thing that's really struck me when we were thinking about this, is you have to make predictions to be surprised,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So it's so no, I mean, and so I think there are many situations where we go in thinking I'm not really exactly sure what's going to happen, and so whatever happens is okay,
Happens, right.
As opposed to I think this is going to happen, and you might be right, you might be wrong, and if you're wrong, you could be surprised.
Yeah.
So there's an element of sort of chance favors the prepared mind,
right?
If you don't go in with any sense of what might happen, then it's hard to be that surprised by what does happen.
Right.
And as a result, the simplest thing to do is simply generate some expectations.
Right. And so that requires preparation, studying,
Yes.
developing a perspective
Yes.
that then will allow you to experience surprise when new information comes in.
Right.
But if you're approaching a problem as a blank slate, right, which I think rarely happens,
No.
right? It's hard to remain in that state for too long.
Right.
Then we're unlikely to really capitalize on it.
And the other piece is put yourself in situations that are changing or different,
Yeah.
right? So if you're in the same setting all the time,
Yeah.
and not a lot of change can happen, well, then not a lot of surprise can happen either.
Right.
So you have to put yourself in situations where it may not be like yesterday.
Yeah, and it's actually interesting that we talked about introducing impasses
Right.
that way, and and so all of these things can happen at once, right? So we actively seek out new situations, and we can experience impasses, meaninglessness,
Right.
Surprise all at once, and perhaps have to sort through all that to be creative.
Absolutely, yeah. No, the cues don't have to stand alone. They can work together.
Yeah.
And some of the same kinds of situations can invoke some of the same cues.
Right.
But of course, they do pop up in different places. So, yeah. So, look, one cue that can help us to stop advancing our current story and make us, hey, wait a minute, consider changing our perspective or building a new perspective is surprise.